On November 28th, the Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations. On November 30th, Soviet troops crossed Finland's borders. Finland's entire army, a total of 300,000 soldiers, including reserves, faced the world's largest army of more than 2 million soldiers, with many millions more in reserve. The first week of fighting demonstrated the power of Soviet armor. Finnish troops were pushed back. Shock and fear accompanied retreat and defeat. They searched for a way to beat back Soviet armor.
Our platoon leader informed us we were about to receive secret weapons that could blow up and burn any enemy tank. It did not take long until the promise was fulfilled.
The Molotov cocktail is probably the most famous poor man's weapon system of the 20th century, and it was named after Stalin's foreign minister, Molotov. If you got up behind the tank and dropped a bottle of flaming gasoline into those air ducts, the flaming gasoline would get sucked into the engine, the tank's fuel would blow up. There was one They were frontal assaults over and over and over again against the same heavily defended Finnish lines. Entire battalions were wiped out.
By December 17th, 3 Russian divisions had failed to breach Finnish defenses at Taipale.
The Russians went in principally for mass attack, which resulted in the attackers being mown down to the last man by a few well-placed automatic weapons. In spite of this, one attacking wave after another would follow with a similar result.
In some cases, the second, third, fourth wave attacks were actually able to get closer to Finnish lines by taking cover behind their own dead. The temperature was so low that after an hour, a corpse would stop a bullet just as well as a brick wall.
The carnage was too much for some defenders.
There were instances where, for instance, Finnish machine gunners became psychologically unstable because they were called upon to commit this absolutely mindless slaughter day after day after day. They may have hated the Russians for invading their country, but these were not automatons. These were human beings with wives and children, and they were being called to murder hundreds of men a day.
On December 17th, the Soviet offensive shifted to the most strategically important and the most vulnerable sectors of the Mannerheim Line, Suma and Ladi. A breakthrough here would open a gate to the city of Viborg.
One flamethrower tank started to throw flames into the trench at Harkkila strongpoint. Fire from Millionaire bunker and from our infantry prevented the enemy's infantry from getting into our trenches. 2 machine guns fired a total of 40,000 rounds.
Juoksivat siinä niin, että piikkilanka-aidoille tulivat ja juoksivat sitten vielä toistensa yli, jotka kuolivat siihen.
The tanks stopped, took casualties, and started to withdraw. This completely demoralized our infantry. The division did not have any success during the day of December 17th, 1939, and after darkness, infantry was withdrawn, having suffered heavy losses.
The battle was stressful, both physically and psychologically. In spite of a whole day of heavy fighting, we were not depressed. The fact that we held on gave us confidence.
That confidence was tested each morning of an unrelenting Soviet offensive.
The enemy's artillery barrage in the morning of December 19th grew to an overwhelming thunder and hit the main defensive line in Summa village the hardest. Our platoon leader gave me responsibility for dealing with the tanks approaching us on the highway. There were no signs of life inside the tank. With our small contribution to the fighting on this day, the hardest of the hardest days was over.
Instead, they sent back trainloads of dead and wounded, and more bad news from the battlefront.
I saw a field and our dead men lying like heaps of grass during harvest. The next day we did not attack. Our losses were too high and the assault was cancelled.
The offensive against Suma and Taipale during the month of December had decimated 7 Soviet infantry divisions.
Stood out like proverbial sore thumbs. You couldn't miss them. As often as possible, the Finns tried to rotate their men so that the frontline troops at least got a few hours of warmth, a chance to have a hot meal. If you're going to fight in that kind of an environment, you have to provide a diet that's extremely rich in protein and fats. The Finns were able to do that. The Russians were, black bread and tea. At 40 below zero, a hot meal is the difference between life and death.
In mid-December, cold and hunger were the decisive factors in a battle Finns called the Sausage War.
But what stopped them was the field kitchens. The Finnish cooks had just put on enough sausage soup to feed the entire 2,000 men in that sector.
Pimeä yö oli ja aina ammuttiin sinne, missä vaan leimatti. Ja sinne päin ammuttiin, ei nähnyt pimeässä mitään tähdätä.
And the Finns were on skis, and they could move very swiftly up and down the length of that column, and they were completely invisible. A barrage of mortar fire, hand grenades, and the ski troopers would surge out of the forest and cut the road. And then disappear on the other side of the road. And after them would come combat engineers who would widen the breach and fortify it to cut off one segment of the Russian column from the other.
They would isolate the units and cut them into what they called mottis, and motti is a measure of wood in Finland. When you chop wood and you stack it up, that's one measure of wood. And that's what they did. They chopped up these divisions.
His body froze in the posture that he was standing in when he was hit.
Men are exhausted and starved. We have about 400 wounded, no petrol. Most of the horses are killed. We are almost out of ammo. Enemy is attacking us from the front. Some commanders are deserting from the battlefield. I request urgent help.
A weird scene in still life. A Russian patrol standing by the side of the road, the men upright and frozen stiff in the snow, a Russian officer beside them, pistol in hand. All had had their throats cut. The officer's pistol was loaded, and not a shot had been fired.
In January, sporadic fighting continued on all fronts. But after 1 full month of war, major operations by the Red Army ceased.
January was largely a lull. Both sides were regrouping. It was a time of taking stock.
The enemy's attacks in December could be compared with a badly conducted orchestra, in which the instruments were played out of time. Division after division was thrown against our positions, but the cooperation between the different arms remained bad.
In January of 1940, Battalion Commander Captain Ryazanov began to plan a breakout. But the battalion's NKVD officer opposed it. He called Ryazanov a coward. Ryazanov replied, "I am in charge. I give the orders." Only 19 men of that battalion survived the war. On March 5th, Soviet troops attempted a flanking maneuver across the frozen Gulf of Finland to surround the city of Viborg. When Finns detected columns of tanks and infantry on the ice, they fired their huge coastal batteries, 12-inch guns, intended to sink battleships.
The weight and velocity of the projectiles was so enormous that it shattered the Gulf ice and opened up yawning gaps, and whole Russian companies disappeared through these holes in the ice.
The Finns' desperate resistance continued with a ferocity that masked a steadily diminishing capacity. By March 12th, they had almost no more ammunition. At noon on March 13th, the word spread along the line. An armistice had been signed. The brutal 105-day war was over.
If a fly had been in the air, he would have heard its buzz. Not a single shot. Dead silence. I did not believe such a thing was possible. Then, people started to regain their senses. Started throwing hats and all kinds of stuff in the air. Almost nothing remained of our battalion. Front line is front line. All I felt was indifference. What do I remember most from that war? It was the incompetence of our army. It could not even deal with a handful of Finns. They showed us how to fight a war.
Gunnar Lahtio, leading a column back toward Finland's newly negotiated border, decided to stop to check on his men.